All right, I think we have a few people here, so I'm going to get us started. Thank you all for joining us for this session. I know it's late in the afternoon and it's Thursday. Some of us are ready for happy hour or a nap. I completely understand. And so I'm glad you're here talking about this really important topic with my panelists that I'm really excited and elated that they joined us for this conversation. I'm going to quickly get us started and ground us in some with a foundation for our conversation today. And I hope to do that with 5 quick points. And then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Nancy, who will talk about the research. So the first thing that I really want us to understand is that every student deserves a learning environment that fosters growth and belonging, where they are safe and free from harm. However, such a learning environment is not possible if corporal punishment is allowable under the guise of discipline. Corporal punishment is still legal in public schools across 19 states, 19. And it's been 10 years since the last state banned corporal punishment. While some states have banned corporal punishment, any student receiving corporal punishment is one student too many. Data indicates that corporal punishment is used on children, specifically students of color, as young as 3 years old. So these are just babies. And let's be clear, Black students disproportionately receive corporal punishment in schools, as well as students with disabilities, making this a key racial justice and educational equity issue. Researchers have connected the practice of corporal punishment to whippings during chattel slavery and the lynchings of the Jim Crow era. Even then, young people were subjected to brutal and inhumane treatment for alleged minor offenses like not picking enough cotton or whistling at a white woman. Today, children receive corporal punishment for offenses like using profanity or breaking a computer. We do this despite research telling us corporal punishment does not teach nor lead to improved behavior and is associated with negative social, emotional, and academic outcomes, including poor behavioral and mental health and reduced cognitive ability and self-esteem. Schools must be safe places for children, and especially for those who may not have safe environments when out of school. Yet, when children are under the threat of physical abuse from adults within their schools, they are not physically, mentally, or emotionally safe. A supportive environment is critical for effective teaching and learning. This is perhaps more important now than ever as students are returning to classrooms after a period of remote learning due to COVID-19. The pandemic has upended the lives of many students and their family, leading to increased isolation, anxiety, stress, and trauma. Therefore, it is incumbent on all states and schools and districts and educators to foster positive school climates and improve discipline practices through evidence-based strategies like training and ongoing professional development for educators, greater involvement of school support staff like nurses, and the use of evidence-based supports like restorative justice practices. While legislators in the remaining states have introduced bills to stop this practice, too little has changed. When George Floyd was murdered on camera, many around the country committed to righting longstanding wrongs. Unfortunately, that momentum is slowing. And it's not only slowing, there is an organized opposition to racial equity and justice under the guise of anti-critical race theory. Therefore, it is up to us to continue educating, advocating, and pushing for identity affirming and safe environments for all students. I am optimistic that the bill recently introduced in Congress, the Protecting Our Students in Schools Act, gives advocates like us the opportunity to meet our goal by banning the use of corporal punishment in schools and provides resources for schools to implement practices that we know contribute to a learning environment designed to help students thrive. That's why we're calling this particular breakout session, Children Cannot Afford to Wait. There is a lot to learn from advocates, and I would like for us to ground today by hearing from those young people and parents who have had this experience firsthand.
I got paddled because the computer lab teacher disliked me. She took me by my uniform shirt and bent me over and started paddling me in front of the entire class. While she was paddling me, she called me all types of names, like ugly and dumb. She told me I was worthless, and I wasn't going to be anything when I grew up.
is the time to end corporal punishment. Now, I don't remember much about this day. I don't remember the preparation or conversations I had before our presentation. I wouldn't have even remembered what I had on if it wasn't for this video. But I do remember, as clear as when I purchased my car, the feeling I had watching my little sister pour her heart out and be courageously vulnerable in front of a crowd of mostly unfamiliar faces. I remember thinking to myself, she has never told this story to me or our mom or, from my knowledge, anyone in our family. I remember hearing and seeing trauma. The trauma, as you saw, could be heard in the crackling of her voice, the sniffles as the air that quickly filled her lungs called constant pauses requiring her to constantly regroup, the tears that flowed from her eyes down her cheeks, and the fear that accompanied it all. How could it not be traumatic for a teacher to degrade you and tell you you would be nothing? My sister got to share her story, but so many others didn't and won't have that same opportunity, so their feelings will forever be suppressed. This is the problem with corporal punishment. It teaches students that they have to suppress their voice or they will be met with violence. The current popular social media phrase is choose violence. School officials should never choose violence when it comes to children. As her brother, her protector, the first thing that went through my mind is, had I been there, this wouldn't have happened. But how often are parents or older siblings around to ensure that this doesn't happen? Not often. This trauma is affecting our most vulnerable population, our Black girls. My sister, like most other students, was energetic, opinionated, and just a kid eager to see her friends each day. She was punished for being herself. Corporal punishment limits a child's ability to freely form their identity.
I even gave him permission. Well, on a Friday, Mr. And another principal came to my house too, because I always write a note saying my kids cannot have corporal punishment. They came because they said they couldn't get me on the phone, and he was like, well, I don't want to send her home to be suspended. Can I just paddle her and just send her on back to class? And I was like, okay, well, I guess that's fine, because I didn't want her home, away from school. But he waited Monday. He called me like 1 o'clock. He was like, he paddled Kiori and he sent her back to class. 3 o'clock came, Kiori came home. She couldn't sit down. I'm thinking, it probably still stung. It was just a few hours before. That night, she slept the whole day after school. That night, she stayed asleep. That morning, I got her for school. She was crying. And I looked at her behind. It was terrible, like black and red, just swollen. So I told her I'm going to school. 8 o'clock came, I called to the other principal, and I told him what went on. Told him about the principal called and said he patted her at 1 o'clock the day before, and her butt was swollen and it was bruised. And he told me to bring her and let the nurses, for his nurses, look at her and don't take her to the hospital. And I took her to the hospital. I called Miss Diane, and she told me just go ahead and take her to the hospital anyway. I took her to the hospital, and I told the doctor what happened. And as soon as he looked at her behind, it's like he couldn't even look at it. He was like, he just took a deep breath. He felt on her butt a little bit to see, was it swollen? She was screaming. And he was like, she had a contusion to the buttocks. But there was nothing he could do because the school, because the principal had did. He just gave him the information. But Kiora couldn't sit on her butt for 4 days. She didn't go to school till the next week. It was just bad. I always make sure I tell them under no circumstances my child to be hit. I'm always to be informed. I don't care what it is she did. No child is that bad to be hit like that.
When he popped me.
I know that that was a heartbreaking video. Every time I see it, it really just pulls at me. And I really appreciate Nolly Jenkins for putting that video together and allowing us to share that video with you all today. I really want us to acknowledge that we're talking about real people. We're talking about real students and families that are affected by this harmful practice. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, who I work closely with around school climate and at EdTrust, who I want her to walk us quickly through some research before we talk to some of the advocates that are doing this work. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Nancy Duchesneau. I am a Senior P12 Research Associate with EdTrust's National Office in DC. Happy to talk to you today about the impacts of corporal punishment on social, emotional, and academic development. Although, honestly, from that video, you could probably sense a lot of the negative impacts already. And so I want to start by this piece of evidence from research that says that schools have worse academic performance in states where corporal punishment is frequently used than in states that prohibit corporal punishment. Why is that? Well, it's because of all of these impacts of corporal punishment. It increases depression, anger, fear. It deteriorates peer relationships. There's difficulty with concentration. It increases what in the literature is called antisocial behavior, but essentially kids are less willing to get along with adults that hit them. And there's a lot of school avoidance as well. And so all of these things really combine in the research to show that there are real problematic impacts of corporal punishment that then lead to harmful academic outcomes as well, because social and emotional and academic development is all integrated together. And we know that because the research from the science of learning and development has shown that all learning is inherently social and emotional. Whether or not students feel like they belong, like they matter, like they're heard, and whether they're emotionally well, all matters for whether or not they can engage academically. And when you are using corporal punishment, you are explicitly telling that student that they don't belong, that they don't matter. And that's really harmful for them. And so instead, we have to really recognize that like well-being, physical, mental, and academic achievement go hand in hand. And so rather than using a paddle or abuse, we should really be showing students that we care for them, building strong relationships. That's what the research says is really important for the social and emotional and academic development of students. And so with that, I'll turn it right back to you, Kayla.
Thanks so much, Nancy. So I'm going to hand it over to our panel. If folks have questions for our panelists, please put them in the chat, and my colleague Sarah can help me make sure that those questions are being answered. First, I'm going to hand it over to Ellen. And Ellen, if there's anything that you want to add or share about that video, please do. But our first question is that I know that our audience is eager to learn about how you have advocated for this issue specifically. And so can you tell us about the organization work you do and how you advocated to end corporal punishment?
Yes, thank you, Kayla. No matter how many times I see that video, Curtivia must have been in 5th grade at that time. She graduated from high school last year. No matter how many times I see that video, it still breaks my heart that this child who wanted to be a teacher for as far back as I can remember was exposed to that kind of violence in the schools. Earlier on, I guess, and we started the organization in 1994, really, and we started as a child care center for teen parents, and we had an after-school program. And I've always taken the position that our center is a no-hit zone. Even before I knew what that term meant, we were a no-hit zone. Inside of our center, you could not hit a child. If parents were experiencing domestic violence, our center was a safe place. We would take your child and not permit others to take your child, like aunts and all of that. So we've always been a place, what we feel a place of safety. We had practiced that script and working with young people for a very long time. And, we go through marked demonstrations at the center before our young people go before the board. And it wasn't until, and I think Curtis hit it on the head when he said she was in front of unfamiliar faces, real familiar faces for Cortevia. But that day really, I think, brought up all of the feelings, and she really went back to that moment of when that happened to her inside the school building. And as you can see, she's a tiny little person. You can just pull her by the suspenders on her pants and you can lift her up. She's a tiny person. Why would anyone want to wrap their hands in her clothing and do that to her? But we've been fighting. I remember early on when we first started the whole notion of we wanted to get rid of corporal punishment. The school buildings were hostile. We would walk into our schools and you could hear children crying no matter where they were in the schools. Principals walked around with paddles under their arms. And it was like women were really interested in this issue around corporal punishment. And I can remember times I would walk into a school and I would ask the question, who's beating that child, when you can hear this all over the school? And so we started early on, but the environment was so hostile. We kind of, you do a test. Are we ready for this yet? Are we ready? That was in the early 2000s. And now the video that you saw today was done in 2012. And so off and on between 2000 and 2012, we would testify, are we ready yet to talk about corporal punishment with the broader community? And even when the young people decided, the young people did what we call a participatory action research. There was a lot of violence going on inside of our communities. One of the things that prompted this participatory action research was a partner had kidnapped his partner, a male partner kidnapped his partner and their 8-year-old child inside of a car. He drove off into the community, into a rural community. He shot his partner in front of that 8-year-old. We were all looking for this 8-year-old, the sheriff's department, and the child walks back to town with blood all over him. Inside the schools, they were going through major beatdowns, on buses. One child would get into a fight and other children would jump into the fight. And our young people just decided it's too much violence going on around us. We gave them a paper and pencil and sent them into the community, in laundromats, in supermarkets, inside their homes, inside of schools, and said, observe and identify what you see going on. And they did that for about 6 to 8 weeks. They came back and said, this is what we see. We see violence no matter where we are. We see violence inside of our homes, between parents and children. What may start as a disagreement eventually spills into a major fight. Kids get angry at home. They come into the school. They bring that negative energy and that hostility into the schools. And so they thought the one environment where we believe we can make a difference is inside the school buildings. And so they really did push for the elimination of corporal punishment. As adults, we supported them in that effort. And so they did petition drives. They knocked door to door. They weren't always greeted with respect, because inside of our communities, we believe and I'm speaking for the Black community, we believe that if we're not strict with our children, if we're not disciplined them in some way, the police will kill them once they get outside the door. That's almost a part of our culture, something that we have to unlearn, because the reality is, if you look at child maltreatment, Black parents and brown parents kill their children more than the police. And so we just wanted to say to our community, we've got to pull back these layers of slavery, of Jim Crow, and look at really what's going on inside of our own families and determine if that is really the route we need to be taking with our children. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks so much for that, Eleanor. I think it's really, really important that we remember that our children can be advocates, right? And empowering them to be advocates is really critically important, especially in fights like this, where they know really well what is happening inside of school buildings, and they know better than us sometimes. A lot of us have been removed from that for quite some time. And so now I want to talk to Morgan. Morgan, can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges that you've experienced in your advocacy and some of the wins, if there are any, around this particular issue?
Sure. I thought I'd just kind of give a quick overview of IDRA's work. So we focus on educational equity issues, including school discipline and policing, which obviously includes corporal punishment. I am based in San Antonio, Texas, but we do our work across the U.S. South. And part of that is through training for educators and administrators and those in schools around research-based strategies to create culturally sustaining schools that feel safe and welcoming for all students. So as several people have already mentioned, part of this effort is stopping what we know is really, really harmful for children, which is beating them, and instead investing in supports and resources and practices that we know are good for individual children, are good for entire school climates, and really help teachers to effectively teach all students in a culturally sustaining way. And so a lot of our work around discipline issues generally and stopping punitive and harmful discipline systems is really to show educators and administrators what they need to be doing instead. So those good things that we know actually work to support children, like restorative practices, like investing in the personnel, including diverse, highly qualified, well-trained teachers and counselors and social workers and all of those supports that we need in schools. I focus on our policy advocacy and community engagement work. And so I want to talk a little bit about policy work against the corporal punishment statute here in Texas, to answer your question, Kayla. So just as a bit of background, Texas is one of the 19 states that still has corporal punishment, and our state law says that a school district board of trustees can adopt a corporal punishment policy for their school district, which will allow teachers or administrators to spank, paddle, slap, hit, or use any other form of physical punishment against children. And so a school district has to affirmatively adopt this policy. And then children are automatically in it unless a parent opts out in writing each year. And so a parent has to be able to read and understand a student code of conduct, has to be able to understand and write a letter saying that they don't want their children involved in it, and submit that every year if they don't want their child corporally punished in schools, which of course creates all sorts of additional problems beyond just the problematic policy in and of itself. In terms of a policy push to end or to get rid of that state law here in Texas, it's been really difficult. And there are advocates here who have been working on this a lot longer than my policy advocacy career in Texas. But consistently for the past few legislative sessions, legislators have filed bills to completely ban corporal punishment in Texas. They cannot get a hearing. They cannot even get an initial hearing. They don't get set for a hearing. And part of that is that the legislature and who gets to decide which bills get hearings in committees is controlled by folks who aren't interested in ending corporal punishment and simply will not bring the bill up for even the most basic discussions, which is extremely frustrating. When I talk to legislators and their staffs about even getting a hearing, I have been told that's simply not happening. Nobody's interested in talking about that. And by the way, we don't agree with actually ending it. And so the question then for a policy advocate is why? What is stopping people from seeing this as an issue that is important to address? And I think that there are a few reasons, that some of which have already come up. Here in Texas, I think that a lot of it is just based on simple education about what is happening in schools. There are policymakers who do not know that we have a corporal punishment policy in Texas that allows school districts to do this to children. I have been on calls where I've said, we need to focus on stopping corporal punishment. And I have actually been corrected and told we don't do that in Texas when it is clearly on the books, and there are clearly data showing that this is happening. And this is, by people, elected officials, who we need to be supportive of it. So I think a lot of people are just shocked that it's happening, and it is happening in the way that it is, and to the degree that it is. I suspect that part of it is also here in Texas, where we have more than 1,200 school districts and charter schools. Some people might not feel like this is an issue that touches them, unfortunately. I totally agree with your slide. If one child is beaten in school, that is one child too many. But a lot of people, I think, don't actually see or feel that because they aren't well connected to the young people and families who are really experiencing this issue. They see it as something that's happening in rural communities. Here in Texas, the large school districts typically don't have these policies. And so I think a lot of folks just aren't touched by it. And that really points to a need in the advocacy community to, again, do more education about the scope of this and why it is a problem that everyone should care about. I agree with what Ellen said. I think there's a huge cultural component that is really stopping people from doing what they need to do to end these policies. And I think there are many aspects to that cultural component. I think it's what Ellen pointed out in terms of some families supporting this approach to how we interact with children. I think that in some, sectors of the faith-based community, there's a belief that this type of approach is what we need. We got to come down hard on children so they don't mess up later. And I think generally what I have literally heard when talking about this issue, people tend to take an I turned out fine approach to this issue. This happened to me. I turned out great. My question is always, did you? But I think people genuinely say, and it's connected to my next point, like this is something that has been part of, a way of life for many people, both inside school, but also at home. And so they see these policies or attempts to end corporal punishment as sort of an indictment of their practices that either happened to them when they were children or that maybe they have in their own families. And I think that presents a barrier. And then the last, sort of why is this so difficult, at least here in Texas and the other states, to end? I just think, this point has been made, just simply racism, like pointing out that this disproportionately happens to Black children, drawing all of the clear connections, as you pointed out, Kayla, the research around connections to where lynchings happened, to a long history of violence against Black people and Black children. I think that it's clear that a lot of policymakers simply don't care about that argument very much, or find a way to justify it and say, well, they must have deserved it or something's going on with them. And so I think that I hate to only give the difficulties here in Texas, but, we still have the policy and it's very frustrating. But I think those are sort of some of the barriers to our work. And most of our wins have really been at the individual district level, working with districts to do something different and do something better.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Morgan. It's really important to think about why we are still doing this. And thinking about some of the data, we know that over 80% of the educators in this country are white. And we are trusting those folks to really discipline our students, and they haven't received any kind of bias training. A lot of them have explicit bias or really have mindsets that bring racism into the classroom. And really that isn't a core issue, right? That goes against some of those Christian values and some of those values we have for Black children in our homes. And so thinking about who actually is committing this is really another important issue that we should highlight. I know Morgan touched on this some, Nancy, but can you talk to us a little bit about what actually schools should be doing instead of things like hitting children, and what actually is effective and based in evidence?
Absolutely. So rather than paddling students and honestly creating a pretty bad school climate, you want to focus on creating a positive school climate. And that means making sure that you're ensuring students feel like they belong there, like they're challenged there, and like they have the supports that they need in order to thrive. So one of the big practices that's an alternative to corporal punishment or even exclusionary discipline is thinking about the restorative practices that Morgan mentioned. And so if we think about it, restorative practices are meant to hold students accountable, but give them opportunities to address conflict and think about how they can make relationships better. And that is challenging for students, right? That's teaching them and giving them opportunities to grow socially and emotionally. Hitting students does not do that. It doesn't challenge them, it just hurts them. And so if you really want to support them, you create practices like that. You also need to create structures within the building and within the district to really support students across the board. That means things like wraparound services or integrated student services, multi-tiered systems of support, making sure that they have access to the community and school and government resources that they need in order to meet their basic needs. Because all of these things are really interconnected, right? Behavior is so connected to whether or not they feel like they socially belong, are emotionally well, mentally healthy, and physically healthy. And so that means things like making sure that you're really engaging the community and the families as well, because if you don't really build those partnerships, then you don't actually know what they need. And so that means really not just having listening sessions or like a PTA where like, you know, the affluent white parents join, but really connecting with communities and making sure that you have a diverse representation of who you're listening to, and making sure that what you're listening to impacts decisions that are made at the district and school level in terms of policy and administration. So those are just some of the things that I think are absolutely critical to create a positive school culture and climate that does the opposite of what corporal punishment can do, and actually is way, way, way more effective than corporal punishment. So try those.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Okay, I'm going to start asking some of the questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to pose this question to Ellen and Morgan. We have a question from Bonnie, and she says, how do you help them see and understand the harm of corporal punishment? And I guess them are those folks who either don't know that it's on the book still, or people who are in the way, those policymakers, those leaders who are really saying this is something that our kids actually need, even though we know that that's not true. Any thoughts from either of you all on Bonnie's question?
I'll take that for the moment. Part of our work, you know, we were able to eliminate corporal punishment in Holmes County. That's where I am. We are a majority Black county. Our school board, all African Americans, all the children that attend our schools are African Americans. And part of this was really an education process, helping parents and policymakers to understand that, first of all, get to know your children. Children in this county, 50% of children under 18 years old in this county live in poverty. As an educator, as a policymaker, I have to think about who are the children I'm really serving? What are the dynamics that may be going on at home? If children are exposed to violence at home, I want to create an environment when they walk into the school building that says you are wanted. This is a safe place for you to be. Because if children don't feel like they have a safe place, a safety net, if things are going on at home, and I've created this environment in school where children can't come and talk to me about what's going on, you know, it only compounds the issue. Part of it, as Morgan said, oftentimes we hear, well, it happened to me and I turned out really great. And I'm challenging people around, what does that really mean? Because when, you know, I think about the policymakers here in Holmes County, I also happen to run a hotline. I'm getting phone calls from some of you policymakers' wives. Now, I won't put that out there. I won't share names, but I know that you didn't turn out that well because I know what's going on in your house, but I'm not going to put that on you. But I'm going to challenge you. Nancy, I see you laughing. I'm going to challenge you. What does that really mean? And we really have to think about, you know, I'm a mother. I'm a grandmother. I've been doing this work for a lot of years. I have a lot of children in my life. I have to really look at me. When things happen between me and children, what am I really responding to? What am I really reacting to? Part of that gets to look at, I have to reflect on who I am, what's been my experiences. I came up in rural Georgia, and you know, I came up in my grandmother's home and my uncles lived around. So, you know, I come from the same kind of environment where I was disciplined harshly. and I saw it going on around me. But I had a grandfather who always asked the questions of people in that community. And he would say this to my grandmother, Luetta, and that was her name, Luetta Nolly, the center is named after her. Luetta, why are you beating those children? We have to really seriously think about that question. Why are we beating children? And so, I see the fear. I see the trauma in children when a parent grabs them. Any more I intervene, I try and put my body in between parents and the things that they're doing in community, because I want to create a different mindset. I think we have to create a different mindset. One of the strategies we're talking about using are the no-hit zones. So we've gotten rid of corporal punishment. You can't tear down a system without building it up. So that's one of the strategies we're looking at. Well, we're starting with the Head Start and early childhood education to say, let's think very differently about children, which causes us to think very differently about our relationship with children and about our relationships with each other. So that's one of the things. And I think someone else talked about this. No, this was in the critical race theory. We have to be open to the dialogue. I hear you. I hear people when they say it worked for me, but I challenge you to really, really think about that. So I think we have to create the dialogue so that people feel okay to put out their concerns, because I want to hear that. But at the same time, I want to challenge them around, we have to treat children very different if we expect different things from children.
Morgan, thank you so much. That was really comprehensive. Morgan, do you have something you want to add about how we get legislators and other policy folks on board with this, with ending corporal punishment?
No, I mean, I agree with everything Ellen just said, and would just emphasize educating people about what this really looks like. And one interesting thing about this issue is that the coalition of people who think this is a bad idea is very broad. And so I think pulling in all of those people, from policy advocates to the legal community, to students, to parents, to doctors, psychologists, all of those folks can sort of take a piece of this and illustrate, like, across the board, this is a terrible idea. I think pulling in members of the faith community who can say, like, this is not actually consistent with our values, and I need you to see that, would be really, really effective, particularly in the states where we are. So, I think bringing together all the people and just, keep talking about it. I'll say one thing that I've noticed here in Texas is, there tend to be very large issues every legislative session that sort of suck up the oxygen, including issues related to discipline and policing. We went through school safety. We've gone through all of this stuff. And I think that I know I need to do this is make corporal punishment the big issue that people focus on.
And it really should be low-hanging fruit, right? Just because it is a broad coalition of folks. It should be the easiest disciplinary action we can get off the books. But for some reason, there is a roadblock for many. As I said, it's been 10 years since another state has ended this practice. And so really hoping for some federal action. We got a question from Dominic. I don't know, Morgan, if you have thoughts on this, but the question is, how accurate is OCR data? And really, honestly, from our opinion, it is self-reported, but just like corporal punishment or suspensions, expulsions, all those things, we're not going to catch everyone. It's really about schools actually documenting those things and reporting them. And we know that a lot of those things happen off the books. So really the answer to that question is it probably isn't comprehensive. It probably isn't counting every kid who has gotten hit. But you know what? It's the best data that we have. Actually, I haven't seen a single state report corporal punishment data outside of that OCR data collection. So it's really the only data that we have. Morgan, do you have other thoughts on that OCR data piece?
No, I think that's exactly right. And if we consider this like the minimum that we're getting, we should still be horrified by it. So let's pretend it's way worse than it looks. I mean, it's terrible now. So yes, there are definitely holes in the data and we don't have the full picture, which is horrible. But what we do have, I mean, there's no question about what needs to be done.
All right. Since we're waiting for the last question I have, because there are advocates in this room, is there any advice that you would give to folks who are maybe new to this issue or have been fighting this fight for a while. I know we have some folks in Tennessee who are really trying to convince their legislators that this is something that they need to do and they need to do now. So any advice that you have for advocates on how to take the next step and really make sure that we're ending corporal punishment right now? And I'll start with Morgan in reverse order this time.
I think the advice I have is just kind of related to what we were just talking about in terms of like building that broad coalition and identifying all of the people. One thing that I always like to do is just see what groups of parents already exist. This is a Facebook search. See what groups of parents already exist and are mobilizing around similar issues and bring people into the conversation. Even if you're doing statewide work, I think we all have a responsibility to bring in the students and parents who are in communities living this, like what Ellen is doing in Mississippi, and make sure that you build up the coalition. And that's going to be like part of the education effort is getting all of those people mobilized and sharing their stories and getting good spokespeople out to do the advocacy and really involving the people who are there in the schools living it.
Yeah, I would agree with Morgan. We've started the Mississippi Coalition to Eliminate Corporal Punishment in October of 2020. And so far, we have families as allies who serve the needs of families who may have mental illnesses. The NAACP in our state is probably the largest organization where you have parents. So we've involved them. We've involved the medical community. We're just reaching out and educating each other around what these issues are and how they impact the lives of children and families. Because, one of the things, as we saw from the video, how powerless does a parent feel when they've given permission for their child to be corporally punished and then an administrator does that? It's one of those things you can't even protect your own child. I can remember in Holmes County, we went through various phases from the size of the paddle. And the other thing that I didn't mention was putting people on school boards that come from the community, who has the vision of the community. So we did that for a lot of years. So we were able to move from a big paddle to, a regimented sized paddle, in iterations. You had to have a witness in the room. If we had opt out, we got parents to sign opts out. And then one day we went to the school and the school got so sick of us, they decided to paste the parents opt out on the wall. And clearly that was a violation of FERPA. So you go through various ways to get this work done. But I think just pulling people together and helping people to realize that corporal punishment does not belong in schools. It does not belong in schools. It's just period. It does not belong in schools. We have to find a different way to be with our children. It has to happen. In the state of Mississippi, of course, you hear in Texas too, state rights. We talked to our legislative members and they said to us, well, first we talked to the Department of Education. It is a legislative act that must be done. We talk to legislators. Then they say these are decisions made at the local level. So you play these various games. So we're now looking at what are the districts in the state of Mississippi who may not be using corporal punishment? Can we get them to ban corporal punishment? And if there's a significant number of those districts that we can get to ban, then why would the state hold on to that? So I think you have to try different strategies. We've got about 3 or 4 strategies going on right now, but we're hoping this legislative session to introduce legislation that eliminates corporal punishment. It's been happening for the last 2 years, but it never gets out of committee. But we're hopeful this year that if we continue to have the kind of widespread support, there's federal legislation that we believe will be significant, that we have to support, that can have an impact on your state policies as well. So we're hopeful that this year we will end corporal punishment for all children in the state of Mississippi in every one of the 10 southern regional states or every one of those 19 states. I think we have to make this fight a fight that we all do together. And I'm in for the fight.
Thank you so much. That was such a powerful ending to this session. Yes, now is the time. And I too am optimistic that this is the year, fingers crossed, that we actually get the work done. So Thank you both, or all three of you all, for joining us on this panel. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the audience questions. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.